It's officially time for the classic yearly tradition of me trying to predict which team will win the championship and inevitably just being very, very wrong. Last year I picked the Milwaukee Bucks. Let's see who I pick this year. Real quick before I get into this video, if you end up enjoying it, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Also drop a like, it only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference on how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm. Also, I just want to give a heads up here, I'm going to be doing a Spurs My GM this year. I'm going to be trying to do it again. If you just don't want to get your hopes up and not bother with it, I wouldn't blame you because I don't have a good track record with finishing these things, but just so you know, that's probably going to come out tomorrow over on my 2K channel. No more of that like uploading one on the main channel. It's not worth it. With that said, my plan of attack here is I'm just going to list every team that I essentially believe can be a contender, and then I'm going to go for a pros and cons list for their chances at a title. If there is a team that I do not mention that you think is a contender, well, I disagree. And there are plenty of teams on this list that barely made it to begin with because I was trying to be a little bit more strict in my idea of a contender here. Oftentimes I'm like, there's like 10 contenders, but like, I think there's 10 really, really good playoff teams and like 6 contenders. So with that said, we're gonna start in the Western Conference where there are a handful more than there are in the East. Starting, of course, with the defending champion Denver Nuggets. In the pro category, obviously, they are the defending champions. They won last year, and if there's any good sign out there that you could win a championship, it's having done it already. It has been proven by them that if they are healthy, they are the best offense out there, and a lockdown defense at that. Jokic's bad defense narrative has been disproven. Hell, even Michael Porter Jr. is a positive defender now. On the con side of things, of course, the obvious standout is Bruce Brown, as he was a huge contributor and an excellent bench piece. Like, truly like an S-tier 6-man for them. But on top of that, something that is not getting mentioned enough, I think, is that they also lost Jeff Green. Not that Jeff is that amazing, but they were running an 8-man rotation in the playoffs, and Jeff was a part of that rotation. So 2 of the 3 players that played off their bench in the playoffs, they're gone. Can they replace that depth? Can someone like Zeke Naji, for example, step up and fill that void? We're gonna have to wait and see. Luckily, I think the Nuggets, in like the kind of Spursian thing that people always say, that like you go to the Spurs and you instantly become better, or you play with Steph or you play with LeBron and you instantly become better. Jokic is definitely one of those guys who can just elevate okay talent into being like genuinely a serviceable rotation player. Then we have to talk about the runner-ups in the Western Conference, the Los Angeles Lakers. Obviously, they lost 0-4 to the Denver Nuggets, so they have an uphill battle to do here, but from the pros' point of view, they were a dominant defense this year. They are also a super deep team, which is different given that just not long ago they were one of the worst teams in the league in terms of depth. Truly an amazing turnaround this roster has made. They also have a ton of versatility. You can have heavy defense lineups, heavy offense lineups, heavy shooting lineups, heavy shot creating lineups. They really just have guys who can do everything. And also, AD is playing at a superstar level with regularity again. He's kind of just tapered in and out of actually playing like that, injuries being a big factor there, so having him more regularly be the guy who can score 28 points per game, it really helps. On the negative side of things though, their perimeter shot creation outside of LeBron is like good-ish, and like good-ish pretty much everywhere. Like Austin Reeves can create, Rui Hachimura can create, AD can do a little bit of creation too, but not really in a perimeter sense. D'Angelo Russell can self-create, and I would say even Gabe Vincent can do it a little bit. It's just that there's no real like truly dominant option in that regard in the shot creation department. Maybe Austin Reeves can be that with like a year 2 leap, or maybe Rui, but one way or the other, sometimes I'm like, is LeBron the only guy that can create a shot on the perimeter? And if so, is that the best option when he's 100 years old? Speaking of that, I think overall an over-reliance on LeBron is something that plagues this team and is really the thing that is ultimately their Achilles heel at every turn. And of course, all of that that culminates in age and health being a huge problem, as not only is LeBron old, but AD is injury prone and LeBron is old and injury prone. That's what I'm getting at. For the Golden State Warriors, they obviously have the experience. They still have that championship core, even if Draymond and Klay are not what they used to be. And then the last thing that I put down is Stephen Curry. And honestly, Stephen Curry is the only reason that they even get this contenders category, because there are a few players in the world throughout league history who, if you have them on your team and you have just a decent core around them, they're a contender, just because that player is that type of dude. And Steph is one of those guys. Unfortunately, it is just a pretty okay roster around him, and not an exceptional one as when the Warriors were a dominant dynasty. So it's not quite the same. In the cons department, there is the age, health, and consistency of this team. It's kind of been hard to put a finger on what exactly the Warriors even are. Even when they won a championship 2 years ago, it was still kind of hard to gauge what they were on a game-to-game basis. Also, what the hell is Chris Paul doing here, and how many different versions of Draymond Green being an asshole is going to end up costing you in some degree or another? That's always a factor to consider, especially of late, it seems. For the Los Angeles Clippers, when Paul George and Kawhi play together, they are insanely dominant. For the cons, they barely ever play together. I really don't feel like elaborating further. We have seen this Clippers team be basically the same team year after year after year, and it ultimately always comes down to, are they going to play or not? The answer is usually not. For the Memphis Grizzlies, the pros are going to be youth, and the fact that I just think overall they are due for a breakout. This is a team that has been very, very young for the past couple of years, and it's felt like they were far from their ceiling. So maybe not this year, but there is going to be a year where they break through that ceiling, at least hopefully, unless things just go horribly wrong, which, you know, seems like Ja Morant's trying to make that happen. A hint at what's in the cons. But overall, the Grizzlies feel like they are due for a breakout sooner rather than later, so that's going for them. Also, they have the Defensive Player of the Year and probably the best defender in the NBA in Jaren Jackson Jr. That's always great. Going from Dylan Brooks to Marcus Smart could not be a more obvious upgrade. Although, now moving on to the cons, Ja Morant doing dumb shit. Is that going to happen again? I would personally wager no. I'm feeling like this is going to be a thing of the past now. Don't hold me to that. I'm not. There's no wood around. This seat's wood. There you go. There's also injury stuff. Jaren Jackson Jr. over the past few years has gotten better about not being a health risk, but he still kind of is. Brandon Clark, I don't know what exactly the timeline of his injury is. I don't know if he's playing at all this year or if he's coming in towards the back end, but he's not going to be there at least for a big chunk of the season. I know that much. That's not good. And there's also not any depth, really. Brandon Clark was kind of the entirety of your depth. And then if you go and look at what that bench is, you have a couple of guys who are interesting and maybe work in a certain context, but not guys that you're like, confidently, these are good options as our backup players. You know, it's just like, okay, John Conchar plays 15 minutes a game. Cool. That's pretty much as good as you're going to get. The Phoenix Suns are lucky I labeled them as a contender. Frankly, that's just because people are going to call them that. I don't believe in this team at all, like even a little bit. But let's say the pros first. They have an insane amount of shot creating talent. They could honestly not have more of it. The only other big three in the shot creation department that is remotely comparable is ironically James Harden, Kyrie, and Kevin Durant from just a few years ago. As for the cons, they are absolutely barren in pretty much every other area of the game. Really not much defense, pretty whatever rebounding, whatever playmaking, and a ton of redundancy, stepping on toes, people being in each other's spots, people taking shots away from each other, and there's also just no depth to this team. Do not let the fact that they signed a couple of names that you've heard distract you from the fact that those names that you've heard are still just fringe rotation guys. The amount of overhyping I have seen for very bench pieces just because people thought the Phoenix Suns would literally get exclusively 2K generics, it's kind of embarrassing to me. And I really don't understand why people are just bending at the knee for this team so much, other than, I guess, Kevin Durant. It's not a well-constructed roster. I'm sorry, it's just not. That said, they have enough talent to win a lot of games. They have enough talent to maybe even push further than they would normally with how poorly the roster is constructed, but ultimately there are going to be teams that are just as talented that are constructed so much better, such as the Denver Nuggets. Just as talented as a whole monolith, not just, the top 3 guys. With that said, we're going to move on to the Eastern Conference, where I only actually labeled 3 contenders. I feel like if I labeled the Cavaliers contenders, I'd kind of also have to label the Knicks that, given that the Knicks beat the brakes off of them in the playoffs. So didn't feel right with that. The Cavaliers, I can see a world where they're contenders more so than the Knicks, but ultimately how bad they played in this postseason left a bad taste in my mouth. Maybe it's something they could bounce back from, but not feeling good about them right now. And I also left the Philadelphia 76ers off this list because they're going through a complete shitstorm right now. And, maybe Daryl Morey guides them through this storm of shit towards actually being a contender, but right now the odds don't look high, and right now they definitely are not. With that said, I also have to give a caveat for this team, which is the Miami Heat. I am putting them here. I would put them here one way or the other, but I'm going to be talking about them here as though the Damian Lillard trade happens. I'm really confident the Damian Lillard trade happens. I think this whole back and forth has been silly and delaying the inevitable. So that said, I am going to proceed with the thought that the Heat have traded some of their bench depth and contracts like Kyle Lowry, Gordon Hayward, etc. And Gordon Hayward, Duncan Robinson. Was I just racist to 2 white dudes? I just milquetoast generic white guy microaggression. That's funny. What can I say? Milquetoast white guys are my people. But yeah, Damian Lillard is a Miami Heat in this scenario. I don't know why I just said it like that. I never understood why people say it like that. Dame is a Miami Heat. What does that even mean? That sounds wrong, right? Anyways, the Miami Heat with Dame, the pros are, kind of everything, right? I've sat here and pondered what the Heat would actually look like with Damian Lillard, and it seems so obvious to me that they would have essentially no weaknesses. There's really only one weakness that I could find, and that is they really could use a bigger forward or 2. Jimmy Butler ended up playing basically power forward all year and in the postseason, and that's silly. You need somebody who's actually a power forward to play that position, especially with Jimmy having as many responsibilities as he does. You don't also need him matching up against bigger players constantly. For the Boston Celtics, the pros are they have improved the roster. Now, the degree to which they improved that roster really depends entirely on what you feel about Marcus Smart. I have had historically mixed feelings on Marcus Smart, but overall came away pretty positive with him. I understand the bad decisions that he makes, and believe me, I'm the type of guy to be critical of those types of things. I also felt like he was more positive than not. That said, this shift, Kristaps Porzingis being moved in instead, could be a better fit, could be a more controlled environment, because Marcus Smart brings chaos where he goes in both great and terrible ways. They have insane versatility and length on defense, and then basically all the other former positives for this team that has consistently made it to the conference finals at the bare minimum. Good stuff on top of great stuff. So on top of that, given how many times they've made the conference finals, and given the fact that this is an improved roster, and given the fact that the East feels fairly wide open if Dame is not a member of the Miami Heat, now would be a good time for it to happen, right? As for some cons, this could maybe be applicable to some other teams like the Phoenix Suns, for example, but especially in the case of the Celtics, they're kind of locked into what they are, and if things are not going well, they don't have much that they can do to turn them around other than internal stuff. In terms of personnel changes, kind of just locked into who you got, and that's not ideal. Also, just because they went from Marcus Smart to Kristaps Porzingis does not mean that we can be confident that they have traded off and gotten rid of their signature Boston Celtics Celtics inconsistency. Don't get me wrong, Marcus Smart, big part of that inconsistency, hugely inconsistent player. But so is Kristaps Porzingis. So it's not like they, got this beacon of consistency to replace this guy who's just a disaster every other game. That's not the reality of the situation, and you still have Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum doing their bullshit whenever they feel like just being terrible for a certain stretch for no reason. So I still will worry about that until it's proven that it's officially just not a regular issue with this team. And thus far, it has only ever been that for like, God, how long has it been now? For the Milwaukee Bucks, this is basically the same core that won a championship 3 seasons ago, so you could argue that they really just need to all get healthy at the same time. Obviously, after their championship, Giannis very nearly advanced them to the conference finals against the Boston Celtics, who would go on to go to the championship. But unfortunately, Chris Middleton was not playing in that series. And if you had a healthy Chris Middleton in a close 7-game series, they would win. Not to discredit Boston, but that would have made a difference there. And next year, Giannis missed, I believe, like 2 of those games. Chris Middleton was good, but still a little inconsistent just because he was hobbled. And then another thing I have in the negatives as well is Jrue Holiday, but we'll talk about that in a second. But you could argue if their core players go into a postseason together and they stay together for a decent enough stretch of time, then they could do it again. The counter argument to that in the cons section is, well, that health has been a problem year after year, and it was a problem before they won a championship, so it's not that much of a surprise that it is after, and that unhealthiness is probably more the norm than an outlier. Not to mention how old this roster is. It feels like for basically anybody outside of Giannis, this team could just, like, players on this team could just completely drop off and it would be reasonable. Like, if Brook Lopez was like out of the league bad after like 2 seasons from now, you know what I mean? Like really bad this year, they give him 1 more year and he's really, really bad. It wouldn't be that surprising because he's super fucking old. Chris Middleton is pretty damn close to super old too, as is Jrue Holiday, who clearly is not at his physical peak. There's definitely room for just one of these guys to be a non-factor because that's the natural way things go. And honestly, that's created a weird environment with the Bucks that I'm probably going to make a video about, where, the age disparity there is Giannis still has another decade that he can contribute to basketball, and Jrue Holiday, Chris Middleton, and Brook Lopez maybe have like 4 years. Ultimately though, they still have that same core, and that core was good, and they've been good statistically when they've been together, so you just hope the stars align, and that would do them a ton of favors. So, going through all of those teams, I'm gonna go ahead and rank my top 3. I would probably rank them all normally. However, just to make another quick self-promo, I'm going to be doing a basically 1 video per team power rankings in descending order thing over on my second channel. So essentially, like, it would be like 2 days, then hot takes, then 2 days, then podcast clip, hot takes, and so on. But basically 4 videos a week breaking down an NBA team going into the season. So I don't want to give you spoilers to what the final list looks like. That said, I can give you my top 3. And my top 3 is, of course, I have the Denver Nuggets repeating as champions. If the Miami Heat get Damian Lillard, and that's what I'm going on based on this prediction, they're probably the only team that I think could really, really interrupt Denver, outside of if maybe Denver really just cannot put the pieces together in terms of their bench unit, which I think they can personally. So the Heat are right below them. And then I want to go with the Boston Celtics because it really feels like it should be between them or the Bucks. And honestly, as I said earlier, the concept of the stars aligning for the Bucks, it feels more like a stretch than not. You know what I mean? Denver, Miami, Boston. That's my top 3 picks in order of most likely to win the championship next year. Can't wait for it to somehow be the Portland Trail Blazers or some shit. I don't know. Shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.